Greetings, everyone, and welcome to my podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture. Let me ask you two questions. Are you a loving person? And would those around you agree with you? My name is Peter Doherty. I'm a Catholic priest and a psychologist who integrates my training in psychology and scripture studies to help understand the Gospels from a different perspective and focus on new pastoral teachings for Christians. The Gospels are a rich source of learning about God and help develop our spirituality. We are far from exhausting the learning potential. My podcasts are between 7 to 10 minutes in length, where I share insights and reflections that I hope will be useful to you. Please don't hesitate to contact me with questions or comments. I always love to hear from my listeners. Today's podcast is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verse 28 to 34. This Gospel will be read in churches November 3rd, 2024. In today's Gospel, Jesus is asked by a scribe, which commandment is the first of all? Jesus answers his question directly. Jesus talked about loving God exclusively with all your heart, mind, and with all your strength. Jesus did not leave anything out. He did not stop there, but teaches us that we are to love our neighbor as ourselves. Jesus would later go on to define his understanding of who is a neighbor in the parable of the Good Samaritan. The first commandment is expected. The second may be more difficult. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 to 48, Jesus teaches us to love our enemies. Many may look at this as an impossible task. It's not impossible to love people we admire or who love us or are similar to us. It's hard, if not impossible, to love those who have hurt us, who have broken our trust. I would like to take a quote from Father Richard Rohr, who clearly points out that unless we transform our pain, we are bound to transmit it. We must make a conscious choice to live by our own values rather than reacting to the behavior of others. That is not as easy as it sounds. Past hurts and broken trust can leave deep wounds on our hearts and make it difficult to be loving. In many cases, we may not be aware of how our wounds can damage our ability to love. We cannot force ourselves or anyone to be loving. We may have to embark on some major healing in our lives before we can be loving to others. The Gospels really make it clear that Jesus sees that loving God and loving others are intertwined. We cannot say that we love God and at the same time hate part of His creation. I would like to suggest 6 things that might help you become more loving. If you think of other suggestions, please let me know. Number 1, appreciate the richness of diversity. Creation is diverse. Choose to be curious about diversity rather than afraid or suspicious. As I get older, I realize that life issues are not black and white or even gray. When we appreciate diversity, we appreciate the multitude of colors in our life and realize there are often many valid ways of doing things. Number 2, choose to be a forgiving person, as referenced in Matthew chapter 18, verse 21 to 22. I am surprised by the number of people who do not understand forgiveness. At the risk of doing a commercial for the book I co-authored with Patty Ann Kay entitled Forgiveness, Breaking Free and Moving On, in it you will find many helpful suggestions around forgiveness. Number 3, remember and reflect on the times you have hurt others. No, I'm not trying to create a guilt trip, but to increase your understanding about hurting others. Work on healing your hurts. You'll be more at risk to hurt others if you have been hurt, as unresolved issues are likely to be repeated. Number 4, develop a sense of detachment. I've spoken about this before. Detachment is detaching ourselves from our expectations of how people should act. The more detached you become, the easier it will be to feel at peace with the person who has hurt you. Number 5, focus on your feelings. I suspect anger and hurt are the primary feelings. I, like many other psychologists, define anger and being hurt as a physiological response to having our expectations violated. Be knowledgeable of the expectations you have for someone, and maybe reducing or changing your expectations might help in the healing process. And finally, number 6, pray for those who hurt you. Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, verse 44, and Luke chapter 6, verse 27 to 28, teaches us the radical nature of Christian love. We are called to pray for our enemies. And when I say pray for those who hurt you, I mean praying for their well-being, their happiness, and their fulfillment, not for them to understand their error in hurting you. Loving God can be a challenge at times because we often do not understand His actions. I think many people prefer to see God in heaven, watching from afar, rather than actively involved in their lives. I have asked this question several times, but it's worth asking again. What does God have to do to get your attention? This is an important question because our best chance to grow in faith and spiritual lives is to experience God in our daily life. The problem is that we often do not recognize the gentle proddings of God's Spirit. God works in our life when we are resilient and open to looking at other interpretations of events and situations in our lives. Spending time in personal reflection can often help. It's not being self-focused to spend time reviewing your day. You may have heard of the spiritual exercise called the examination of conscience. Unfortunately, we do not hear as much about this practice as we once did. This daily practice encourages personal holiness and a deeper love for God and others, guiding individuals through moral challenges. Unfortunately, people have focused on what they did wrong. The practice can be so much more. I encourage people to reflect not only on their moral challenges, but also to examine their successes, to ask oneself, what were the spiritual lessons we were introduced to that day? Focus on what you want to do differently tomorrow. Avoid the attitude of judgment or self-criticism if you have not lived up to your goals. Be gentle with yourself. You're more likely to be successful later. Remember, we have many examples of the disciples getting it wrong before they got it right. Unfortunately, I cannot guarantee that you will suddenly become more loving, but I believe you will be moving in the right direction. Jesus had a lot of patience for people who tried to do good but were not successful immediately. I'm reminded of the tax collector and the Pharisee found in Luke chapter 18, verse 10 to 14. While the focus of the story is humility, it is clear that even the tax collector could be reconciled with God. Thank you for listening. I invite you to join me next week when I examine the Gospel of Mark, who describes Jesus' teaching about being authentic and spiritual. If this is the first time you've heard my podcast and you're interested in hearing more, I urge you to listen to my podcast listed on the website. Every Sunday, I release a new podcast focusing on the gospel for the following week. I invite you to listen to all the podcasts, and I hope the reflections are useful to you. The podcast, A Psychologist Looks at Scripture, is found on most platforms that carry podcasts. The podcast is also available on YouTube. Please do not hesitate to leave a review, and maybe even consider subscribing. Feedback from my listeners can be helpful in the development of the podcast. I would also like to thank my team, Heather Patel-Doherty and Ritu Coulomb, who play an important part in the preparation of this podcast. If you have any questions or concerns, I can be reached by email at peter.doherty, O-M-I, that's DOHERTYOMI, @gmail.com. God bless you and have a great week.